Ever get that feeling, learner, like you're on this treadmill, constantly learning, reading articles, books, maybe going down a Reddit rabbit hole, but then wondering, like, is any of this really sinking in? Well, today we're doing a deep dive on that very question. Can you actually have too much knowledge? And joining me to unpack this is a true expert in information overload.
Well, it's a fascinating question, and to really get into it, we're looking at this piece by Sergey Melnichenko. He's an organizational consultant and agile coach, and he really struggled with this himself. He calls it maintaining good psychological hygiene, in this age of just constant learning, which I think is a really interesting concept.
Okay, psychological hygiene. I like that. It sounds essential, kind of like flossing for your brain, but maybe a little ominous too. So what does that even look like? And how do we know if we actually need it?
Well, that's the big question, right? And Melnichenko really focuses on uh, those intellectual professions,
Yes.
like scientists or people in tech, even managers, those fields where you always have to be learning to keep up. He has this great line: to stand still, you need to run.
Wow. Yeah, that really hits home. It's like to just stay current in those jobs, you're constantly having to learn new information and new ways of thinking. But when do we actually get to use all of it?
And that's exactly the issue he ran into, right? He realized that the more he was learning, it's like the less he was actually doing. Like his brain was this inbox that was overflowing with like articles he hadn't read and online courses he'd only half finished, all this knowledge just sitting there. So he uses this analogy to kind of show what he means. Imagine there's this programmer, let's call her Alice, and she has to learn this new coding language for a project, right? So she starts reading tutorials, watching webinars, maybe even goes to a conference.
Okay, so she's definitely motivated, right? Taking the initiative to learn. I feel like a lot of us have been there.
Totally. But here's the thing. Melnichenko says that actually learning it, like Alice is doing, it's not really enough. To really get it, she has to integrate it.
Integrate. There's that word again. It seems pretty important. But what does that actually even mean? Like, practically speaking, it's got to be more than just remembering what she learned, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's about taking that new knowledge and actually using it,
Yeah.
like weaving it into her skills, how she works, even how she solves problems. It's about connecting the theory to actually doing it.
No, it's less about just cramming in more and more information and more about figuring out how to use what Alice already knows, but in a way that actually makes a difference.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where Melnichenko's own experience comes in. He realized that with his work, all the consulting and coaching, even teaching, he didn't really have time for that integration part. He had all this new information coming at him constantly, but there was no time to really absorb it and make it useful.
So it's like he had all the ingredients for this amazing meal, but no time to actually cook, just like a pantry full of potential. And I think a lot of us, especially in those fast-paced jobs, we can relate to that.
Oh, for sure. And that's what made him realize that the solution is, well, it's pretty simple. It's rest. And not just any rest, but like intentionally resting without taking in any new information.
So it's kind of like hitting the pause button, huh? On all that new information, I mean, giving our brains a chance to really process everything. It's kind of weird when you think about it, right? Like, we're always told to keep learning, but taking time to not learn. That's almost rebellious these days.
It really is. Melnichenko actually, he compares it to a python digesting, like a big meal. It needs that time to, just be still and process everything. And we're the same way, right? Our minds need that downtime or else burnout.
Burnout. Ugh. That feeling of like running and running, but getting nowhere. Is that what happened to Melnichenko?
Yeah, he definitely hit that point.
Hmm.
And he's cautious about, falling into that trap of
Mm.
learning, 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 but never actually using any of it. It becomes this cycle of like always wanting more information, but then we don't see the benefits. You know what I mean? We don't actually feel like we're getting anywhere. And that's a recipe for, well, yeah, for burnout.
So, learner, what do we do? We've talked about the problem, the whole information overload thing, and why integration is so important, and of course, burnout. But, like, what's the answer? What are we actually supposed to do?
Well, Melnichenko really makes us think about prioritizing that psychological hygiene,
Mhm.
being as intentional about downtime as we are about learning new things. So that means making time to think, to actually try out new skills, or even just like letting ourselves process everything.
So, like, we don't have to stop learning completely, right? It's
Yeah.
more like finding that balance between learning new stuff and actually integrating it, realizing that sometimes the best thing we can do is just step back,
Hmm.
let our brains catch up a little.
Yeah, exactly. And that looks different for everyone. Maybe it's scheduling time to like just think, or trying out that new skill you've been reading about, or even just taking a walk without listening to, a podcast or anything. It's about making that space for your mind to wander a bit, to process and make connections.
Just like the real learning, the stuff that sticks, that changes how we see things, it doesn't just happen when we first learn it, right? It happens in that space afterward, too.
Yeah.
And learner, on that note, we'll leave you with this. What does psychological hygiene look like for you? How can you build in those breaks, those important pauses for rest and integration? Something to think about as you navigate your own learning journey. And until next time, keep diving deep. But don't forget to come up for air every now and then.